The Kennecott copper mine in Alaska was offering double the standard pay for safety inspectors, and not a single person in the nearest town could give me a straight answer as to why. I had just turned 26 in the fall of 2008, struggling to make ends meet after mining school had buried me in loans. With the economy in a nosedive, my engineering degree felt pretty useless. The man who hired me, Vernon, had a glass eye that drifted aimlessly while his real one stared right through you. He kept emphasizing how isolated the mine was, repeating it over and over like a threat disguised as casual conversation. He slid the contract over his desk with just the tips of his fingers, as if he were afraid to touch it for too long, and informed me that the job required a minimum 6-month commitment. He said there would be no exceptions, regardless of what I might see or hear. The salary was enough to pay off all my debt with plenty left over, enough to finally escape the basement of my parents' house where I'd been living since I graduated. When I signed the contract, Vernon's good eye twitched, and he mumbled something under his breath about hoping I'd be different than the ones who came before. The mining camp seemed to cling to the mountainside against its will, a collection of rust-covered buildings and warped wooden walkways that groaned under my feet. On my first day, I observed the crews as they prepared to enter the tunnels. They moved in tight clusters, their shoulders nearly brushing, with no man straying more than an arm's reach from the others. My new roommate, Craig, was a burly drill operator who had an obsession with organizing his baseball cards, filling our small kitchen table with elaborate spreadsheets of player statistics. He chewed tobacco without pause, spitting the dark juice into a row of old soup cans on our windowsill. He had a peculiar ritual of counting the miners as they went into the tunnels each morning, counting them again at lunch, and one last time at the end of their shift. When I asked him why, he just said that management's records weren't always reliable, and someone needed to make sure that everyone who went down came back up. On my third day, I was sent to inspect Tunnel 7 with a pair of seasoned miners named Frank and Eduardo. Frank had been working there for 11 years, a fact that seemed to make him a living legend among the other workers. He carried a ball-peen hammer everywhere and had a strange habit of tapping the tunnel walls with it every few feet. He explained it wasn't to check for structural weakness, but to let anything or anyone in the deeper shafts know that we were approaching. Eduardo, who was younger but had the weathered look of a man who'd spent 5 years underground, constantly fiddled with his headlamp. He would click the brightness from high to low and back again in what seemed like a deliberate, rhythmic pattern. They were adamant that I walk behind them, never in the middle, so they could both keep an eye on me. Every time we passed an old tunnel entrance that had been sealed off with a thick slab of concrete, they would fall completely silent until we were at least 50 feet beyond it. Once you got deep enough into the mountain, you saw these sealed tunnels everywhere. They were just concrete plugs with dates and numbers stenciled on them, some dating back to the 1960s. A few had official warning signs, but most were just marked with numbers and initials, offering no clue as to why they were permanently closed. In the safety office, I found an old logbook from 1987. It mentioned structural problems in sections of the mine that were nowhere near any known fault lines. The pages for the months of September through November of that year had been violently torn out. When I showed the book to my supervisor, a man named Briggs, who always smelled faintly of sweat, he snatched it from my hands and said he would look into it. I never saw the logbook again, but I began keeping my own secret journal, which I hid in a slit I cut in my mattress. The event that set everything off happened on a Wednesday morning when the temperature had plunged to 15 below. I was in the office looking over equipment manifests when Craig burst in. His face was ashen, and he had a stream of forgotten tobacco juice running down his chin. He grabbed my shoulders, his grip so tight it would later leave bruises, and kept repeating that Tommy Fitzgerald's crew never came up. They had entered Tunnel 4 at 6 that morning for a simple assessment of a copper vein. It was just 3 men with standard equipment, and now it was well past noon. The elevator operator, an elderly Vietnamese man named Duck, swore on his wife's rosary that he had never brought their car back to the surface. But the most chilling part was that their names were already crossed off the morning roster as if their shift was over. The handwriting was a perfect match for Tommy's, right down to the distinctive curve of his T's. A search party was organized, though I saw how the veteran miners all found reasons not to go. One guy's gear was suddenly malfunctioning. Another had urgent paperwork to file. Finally, the search party consisted of just me, Craig, Frank, and two new guys, Bradley and Kevin, who had only been there for 3 months. The elevator ride down felt like we were descending into the Earth's throat. When we got to Tunnel 4, we found the crew's equipment scattered by the entrance. Their helmets were arranged on the ground in a perfect triangle, with the headlamps still on, their beams converging in the center. Their tools were there too, but they were twisted into impossible shapes, drill bits bent into spirals, pickaxe handles wrapped around their own heads. Frank grabbed my arm and pointed to the ground where I was about to step. Scratched into the rock were the words, "They make us dig ourselves out." The letters were jagged and desperate, apparently carved with fingernails, as there was dried blood in the grooves. Bradley began to hyperventilate, his panicked gasps echoing down the tunnel. Kevin tried to back toward the elevator, saying he had to report this, but Craig blocked his way. He explained in a dead calm voice that management already knew everything and that reporting it would only ensure that we were the next crew to disappear. That's when we heard it. A rhythmic scraping sound from deeper in the tunnel, metal against stone, as steady as a clock's tick. Every nerve in my body screamed to run, but Frank was already moving toward the sound, his hammer raised. We followed, because even the new guys knew that splitting up in these tunnels was a death sentence. About 200 feet in, the shaft opened into a large cavity that wasn't on any of the mine maps. The walls were unnervingly smooth and perfectly circular. In the center of this strange chamber stood Tommy Fitzgerald. His back was to us, and he was making that scraping noise with the remains of a shovel. His clothes were in tatters, and his skin was covered in what looked like perfect, coin-sized chemical burns. When Frank called his name, Tommy turned, and we saw that his eyes were gone. They weren't gouged out. They were filled with a milky white substance that had hardened like plaster. His mouth opened and closed, but all that came out was a wet, clicking sound. He continued to scrape the shovel against the wall, writing the same set of numbers over and over. 31,785,219. Craig recognized them first. He whispered that they were the employee ID numbers of miners who had vanished in 1994. The shovel handle seemed to be fused to Tommy's palms, the flesh of his hands worn down to the bone. Behind him, we could see the other members of his crew, or what was left of them. They were partially embedded in the rock walls, their bodies twisted into unnatural angles, their chests still rising and falling in unison. Bradley started screaming, and at that moment, the lights in the tunnel began to fail, one by one, as if something was moving toward us from the darkness, snuffing them out as it came. Frank shoved us all back toward the main shaft. Tommy followed us, scraping his shovel and leaving a trail of blood and a clear, thick fluid that smelled of hot copper. Kevin slipped in it and went down. When Craig helped him up, the fluid had eaten through his pants, leaving the same circular burns on his legs. The elevator was still there, but Duck was gone. Only his rosary lay on the control panel. Some of the beads melted into the metal. Frank knew how to operate the lift, and as we started to ascend, the scraping sound followed us up the shaft. The elevator suddenly lurched to a halt between floors. Through the grate in the floor, we could see Tommy climbing the shaft walls, his broken fingers finding impossible holds on the smooth metal. The emergency phone was dead, emitting only a thick static that sounded like breathing. Craig managed to kick open the emergency hatch, and we scrambled out onto the roof of the elevator car and then up an emergency ladder. We burst out of an auxiliary exit onto the surface just as the sun was setting, only to find the entire camp completely deserted. In the main office, we found the staff roster. Every single name, including our own, had been crossed out in Tommy's handwriting, with our times of death listed as 20 minutes before we had even started the search. Craig grabbed the satellite phone, but the only response was a recorded message stating that the Kennecott facility had been permanently closed 3 days ago. We took the only working truck and drove for 14 hours straight to Anchorage, too terrified to speak. When we tried to file a report with the state police, the officer showed us a news article. According to the report, the mine had been closed for renovations for months, with no workers on site. Our employment records didn't exist. When Craig called his wife, she told him he'd been homesick all week. But we still had Kevin's burned legs and my secret journal. The officer made a phone call, and soon, men in suits arrived. They separated us and questioned us for 18 hours about gas leaks and hallucinations. Eventually, they had us sign non-disclosure agreements, admitting we had trespassed and suffered from group psychosis. The unspoken alternative was that we would disappear just like Tommy's crew. We all took the settlement money and went our separate ways. I ended up in Oregon working construction. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear that rhythmic scraping sound. We have a group text, and every Sunday at 14:33, we all check in. So far, everyone still responds. So far. The storage room in the basement of our forensic lab has always been a place that gives people the creeps. But last Saturday, I learned exactly why. I'm a 28-year-old grad student working in forensic anthropology here in Juneau, cataloging unidentified remains for the state. Most of my job involves measuring bones and trying to match dental records to old missing persons cases. It pays the rent and provides material for my dissertation. That morning, I had volunteered for the unpleasant task of organizing the pre-1950 case files. They had been stored in a damp, mildew-scented room in the basement since a flood in the 70s damaged our archives. Armed with gloves, a mask, and a large thermos of coffee, I went down to that narrow room where the fluorescent lights buzzed and flickered. While moving a rusted filing cabinet, I found a manila folder that had fallen behind it decades ago. The faded label read, ML 1930, unresolved. Inside were brittle photos, old witness statements, and a hand-drawn map of hiking trails near Juneau. The map was covered in X's, each marked with dates from 1930 to 1978 and a set of initials. The main photograph showed a young woman with dark, wavy hair, identified as Mary Thorne, a 22-year-old schoolteacher who had disappeared during a solo hike. The official report said that searchers had found her belongings neatly folded beside the trail, her jacket in a perfect square, her boots placed side by side. There were no signs of a struggle. Mary herself had simply vanished. An investigating officer had noted that the scene looked deliberately staged. It was the map that truly unnerved me. The X's weren't random. They formed a clear pattern along a specific elevation on the mountain. I cross-referenced the dates and initials with our missing persons database. The basement suddenly felt 10 degrees colder. Every single set of initials and date corresponded to a missing female hiker between the ages of 20 and 30 who had been hiking alone in the Juneau area. In each case, their belongings were found neatly arranged, but their bodies were never recovered. Instead of taking the file to my supervisor, I dug deeper into the boxes. I found a leather journal belonging to Silas Holbrook, the very same trapper who had been interviewed as a witness in Mary Thorne's case. The first entry was dated May 1930. My mouth went dry as I read through his obsessive, clinical descriptions of female hikers. He noted their routines, their habits, and which ones hiked alone. He wrote about Mary Thorne for 3 weeks before she disappeared. His journal continued for decades, documenting what he called his collection process. He wrote of preserving certain hikers who met his standards and taking them to his private sanctuary. The entry stopped abruptly mid-sentence in 1978. Tucked in the back of the journal was a newspaper clipping, an obituary for Silas Holbrook, who had died of a heart attack at age 73. It mentioned he was survived by his grandson, Michael Holbrook, who had recently returned to Juneau to take over his grandfather's guide business. My laptop screen had gone dark, and in the black reflection, I thought I saw movement behind me. I spun around, knocking over my coffee, but the doorway was empty. I checked my phone and saw I had no signal in the basement. I started frantically photographing the journal pages when I heard the stairwell door open one floor above me. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, coming down towards the basement. There was no weekend security, and I was supposed to be the only one in the building. The door handle turned, and a man stepped into the hallway. He was tall, in his mid-50s, and wore a Forest Service uniform that looked oddly old. He had pale gray eyes and a practiced smile that didn't seem genuine. He introduced himself as Michael Holbrook. He said his company maintained the trails and worked with the medical examiner on recovery operations. He walked into the storage room, his eyes scanning the boxes I had been sorting, lingering on the empty space where I had found the journal. He asked if I had found anything interesting. I noticed the dirt caked deep under his fingernails. I stammered something about water damage as he picked up one of Mary Thorne's photographs. My grandfather knew her, he said quietly. He told me stories about all the hikers. Said the mountain takes who it wants. He shifted his weight, subtly blocking my path to the door. My grandfather taught me everything about these trails. He continued. Every hidden path, every cave. He had his special spots. The way he said, special spots, made my skin crawl. He pulled out his phone and showed me a recent photo of himself with a group of smiling young women in hiking gear. I run guided tours now, he said. Very popular with solo female travelers. He then pulled out a worn leather wallet. My grandfather kept detailed records too, he said, unfolding a yellowed piece of paper. He even kept a list of researchers who showed too much interest in certain cases. Before he could continue, we heard the loud voices of the weekend cleaning crew from the hallway upstairs. Michael's friendly mask cracked for a second, revealing something cold and calculating underneath. He put the paper away and stepped aside. If you ever want to see those trails Mary Thorne hiked, he said, I'd be happy to show you. My grandfather showed me the exact spot. He placed a business card on the table, his muddy fingers leaving a smear across it, and then he left. I waited until the cleaning crew was right outside the basement door before I ran. In the parking lot, fresh tire tracks in the mud showed that Michael's truck had circled the building twice before leaving. I drove straight to the police department. The detective on duty, Grace Navarro, listened to my story and looked at the photos of the journal. Within an hour, they had a team at the storage facility. Grace told me they had been investigating a series of missing female hikers, all of whom had taken guided tours with Holbrook Wilderness Adventures before disappearing. They had never had enough evidence for a warrant, but the journal changed everything. They arrested Michael Holbrook 3 days later at his remote cabin. Beneath the cabin, they found an underground storage space containing personal items from 17 different women, with dates matching missing persons, reports going back to 1979, the year after his grandfather died. They also found human remains preserved in industrial freezers. Michael had continued his grandfather's work for 46 years. The prosecutor said the journal was the key that broke the case. Search teams are still combing the mountains, using that old map to find the victims from Silas's era. I've since moved back to Washington, but I still wake up sometimes, thinking about Michael's gray eyes and his practiced smile, and wondering how many women trusted him right before he led them to his grandfather's special places. In the fall of 1971, I took a job with a small logging outfit working about 40 miles outside of Alaska. The spruce trees there grow so dense you can barely see 10 feet in front of you. I was 32 at the time and had been handling chainsaws since I was a teenager. My crew was small, just 4 of us. Myself, an old-timer named Walter, a young kid named Danny, and our foreman, Steve. We set up our camp at the entrance of a valley the locals called Silent Valley. The job was supposed to be simple. Clear 20 acres of trees for a new access road. We figured it would take 3 weeks at most. The first few days were normal, except for the quiet. I've worked in plenty of remote places, but this valley was different. It had a strange kind of silence that made you hyper-aware of your own heartbeat. Walter commented on it, saying that in all his years, he'd never been in a forest so devoid of bird calls or the sounds of small animals. But we had a job to do, so we kept on cutting. It was on the 5th night that I first heard them. I had gone to bed early, exhausted after a long day. The other guys were still up playing cards. As I was drifting off to sleep, I heard what sounded like people talking, far off in the valley. It wasn't yelling, just the calm cadence of a conversation. The strange part was how clearly I could hear it, occasionally catching a word or two, even though it sounded miles away. The next morning, I asked the others if they had heard anything. Danny just shrugged, but Walter gave me a long, knowing look. Steve said he thought he'd heard something around midnight. He figured it was just some hunters passing through, even though hunting season was still a month away. Walter finally admitted that he'd been hearing voices for the past 2 nights. He said they always came from deeper in the valley, from the sections we hadn't cut yet. That morning, the sound of our chainsaws seemed to roar, amplified by the total lack of any other noise. Around noon, my saw suddenly died. In the abrupt silence, I heard the voices again. This time, they were clearer, and I could have sworn they were speaking English, but the words were slippery, impossible to hold on to. Like a dream, you forget the moment you wake up. They seemed to be coming from 3 different directions at once. That night, none of us wanted to admit we were scared, but we all sat around the fire much later than usual. Steve had tried the 2-way radio earlier, but all he got was static with a strange rhythmic pulse in it. Walter told us a story about a crew he'd worked with years ago who had abandoned the job nearby. He wouldn't say why, only that the forest up here could play tricks on a man's mind. He said one of the old-timers from that crew believed the mountains held onto sounds from the past, conversations of people who had passed through centuries ago. The 7th night changed everything. I was woken around 2 a.m. by my own name being called. Tom, the voice said, as plain as day, like someone was standing right outside my tent. The voice sounded familiar, but distorted, like a recording played at the wrong speed. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped my tent, but there was no one there. Then I heard it again, my name, coming from the opposite direction. I saw Walter standing outside his tent, looking just as confused as I was. Before I could speak, we both heard Danny's voice coming from the valley, even though we could see Danny's silhouette sitting up in his own tent. Then we heard Steve's voice from the tree line, asking the same question he had just asked us in camp. We were standing there, 4 grown men, listening to our own voices, having conversations we weren't having, coming from places we weren't standing. The worst part was when we heard Walter's voice from deep in the valley say, "We should leave. Pack up right now and leave." The real Walter was standing right next to me, his mouth hanging open. Those were the exact words he had been about to say. The next morning, Walter was gone. His tent was still zipped up from the inside, but his boots were missing. We found his tracks leading into the valley. They were steady and purposeful, and after about a quarter of a mile, they just stopped, mid-stride, in a patch of soft dirt. There were no other tracks, no signs of a struggle. They just ended. We spent the morning searching and calling his name, but the only response we got was the sound of our own voices echoing back at us from impossible directions. Around noon, Danny found Walter's chainsaw sitting upright against the tree, the gas tank full. We were packing up to leave, to hell with the job, when we heard it. Walter's chainsaw, that distinctive growl he was so proud of, started up somewhere deep in the valley. We were paralyzed because we could all see Walter's actual saw sitting in the back of Steve's truck. The sound led us to a grove we hadn't touched yet. We found freshly cut stumps, the air thick with the smell of pine. The cuts were clean, just like Walter would have made them, but there was no one there. And Danny pointed out that the trees had been cut from the inside of the grove out, with no path cleared to get to them. That was it for us. We ran back to camp and threw everything into the trucks. As we were leaving, I heard Walter's voice one last time, clear and close, as if he were standing right behind me. "The valley keeps what it wants," he said. We drove out of there at a dangerous speed. A few miles down the road, a forest ranger flagged us down. Steve told him about Walter. The ranger, an older man, just nodded, like he had heard this story before. He said he didn't expect to find anything. They found Walter's body 12 days later, 2 miles from our camp, in an area we had searched 3 times. The coroner said he'd been dead for at least 10 days. There were no injuries. He was just sitting at the base of a tree as if he'd fallen asleep. His feet were bare and perfectly clean. None of the strange details made it into the official report. The authorities said he had wandered off, disoriented, and died of exposure. But his tent didn't have a heater, and it hadn't been nearly cold enough for that. I never went back to logging. Sometimes, on very quiet nights, I still hear Walter's voice in my head. And I know that Valley is still out there silent and still keeping whatever it wants. Last August, I was staying at my uncle's fishing lodge, about 60 miles northwest of Fairbanks. He's owned the place since the 70s, a rundown cabin near a tributary of the Tanana River. I went there alone that summer after my divorce, needing some quiet. The nearest neighbor is 8 miles away. My uncle Nathan always said the place had good bones, but bad history. He bought it for next to nothing from an old-timer whose brother had vanished while hunting there in the 1950s. After a few days of fishing, I decided to explore a marshy section of the property I'd never visited before. About 40 minutes into my hike, my boot got snagged on a piece of metal sticking out of the boggy ground. I assumed it was just old farm equipment, but when I bent down, I saw it was aluminum, not rusted iron. The metal had a strange greenish coating, the kind that forms on aircraft aluminum after it has been sitting in acidic soil for a long time. There were numbers stamped into it, AF, followed by some digits I couldn't make out. It was definitely a military designation. I started digging around with a fallen branch. About 3 feet down, I hit something that made me freeze. It was a leather military issue boot from the 40s or 50s. Perfectly preserved by the bog. Tucked inside the boot was a small, waterlogged field journal and a tarnished silver wristwatch, stopped at 217. Something made me keep digging. An hour later, I found more aluminum fragments and a leather wallet. Inside was a military ID, mostly destroyed, but I could make out Sergeant J, and a birth year starting with 192. There was also a photograph of a young woman holding a baby. I realized the debris wasn't scattered randomly. It formed a rough line heading northeast, as if a plane had come apart in the air. I followed the line of depressions in the moss for about 200 yards. It led me to a hollow filled with standing water. Just below the surface, I could see the outline of a large section of a plane's fuselage, broken open like an eggshell. On an intact section of the interior wall, I could see the stenciled letters USAF. The cargo area had heavy-duty tie-down ports, far stronger than what would be needed for regular supplies. Caught on a jagged piece of metal was a dark blue wool Air Force jacket with sergeant stripes on the sleeve. The name tape was faded but readable, Morrison. In the chest pocket, wrapped in a rubber pouch, was a folded set of orders dated January 15th, 1950. The text mentioned classified cargo pursuant to operation, followed by a blacked-out word. Below that were coordinates that matched my exact location. I was so focused on the orders that I didn't hear the helicopter until it was right on top of me. A white and blue civilian Bell helicopter circled low over my head twice. I could see someone in the passenger seat with binoculars pointed right at me. Then, they banked hard and flew off toward Fairbanks. In all my years of visiting this property, I had never seen an aircraft fly so low over this area. I grabbed everything I could carry, the journal, the watch, the wallet, the orders, and headed back to the cabin. As I examined the items on the kitchen table, I noticed a partial sentence visible on the edge of the fused journal pages. Cargo is reactive to, and another fragment that read, men showing symptoms of. Around 8 p.m., 3 black SUVs with no government plates pulled up to the cabin. A man with a military haircut introduced himself as Mr. Carlson from the EPA. He said they were investigating reports of possible contamination from old Cold War operations and asked if I had seen any unusual debris. His tone was casual, but his men were already walking the perimeter of the cabin. I played dumb. He handed me a business card with only a phone number on it and suggested it would be safer if I headed back to town until they completed their survey. It wasn't an order, but I knew I had no choice. As I drove away, I saw a convoy of lights heading toward the marsh. I drove straight to Anchorage and put the items in a safe deposit box. The next morning, I called my Uncle Nathan. He was quiet for a long time, and then he told me that his brother, the one who disappeared in the 50s, had been found dead 3 weeks after he went missing. The official cause of death was exposure, but his body had strange burns and his hair was falling out. The local doctor couldn't explain the symptoms, but warned the family not to talk about it. My uncle's father spent years writing to the Air Force, asking what had happened in January 1950, what had fallen from the sky that winter. He never got a response, only visits from federal agents who told him to stop asking questions. 2 weeks later, I went back to the site. The entire marsh had been excavated down to the bedrock. The ground was leveled, and new no trespassing environmental remediation area signs were posted everywhere. But when I checked the EPA's official contamination database, there was no record of any cleanup operation at those coordinates. I tried calling the number on Carlson's card from a payphone. A voice just said, "Yes." When I asked for Mr. Carlson, the line went dead. The number was disconnected an hour later. I still search online for any mention of that flight from 1950. Every few months, another document or database entry I've bookmarked is scrub it from the internet. But I kept the items, and sometimes I look at that photograph of Betty and her baby, wondering if they ever found out why their husband and father never came home. In January of 1978, I was part of a search and rescue team sent to look for an old trapper named Bill Carver, out near the Yukon River Basin. Bill was one of those old-timers who knew the wilderness better than anyone. When his sister reported that he hadn't checked in since November, we all figured his radio had just died. But when he didn't show up at the trading post for Christmas, they called us in. The flight out to his cabin was rough. From the air, we could see something was wrong. The cabin roof was partially caved in from the snow, and there were no tracks leading to or from it. The strangest thing was the absence of his sled dogs. There was no sign of them at all. The pilot, Roger, set us down on the frozen creek, and the silence was absolute. When we reached the cabin, the door was frozen partially open. Inside, everything was incredibly neat and organized. His supplies were stacked, his bunk was made, and his tools were laid out on a workbench. The only thing out of place was his journal, left open on a small table. Most of the entries were what you'd expect. Notes on the weather, trap yields. But starting in mid-November, the tone changed. He wrote about wolves more than he had ever seen in 40 years. At first, he just observed them. Then, he wrote about how they would circle his cabin at night, not howling, just walking endlessly. He counted them by the reflection of their eyes in his lantern, light sometimes 12, sometimes 15. Once he thought he saw 23. By late November, the entries became desperate. He wrote that the wolves had stopped hunting. They just stayed near the cabin, watching him from the tree line. He tried firing his rifle to scare them, but they didn't even flinch. "They know I'm alone," one entry read. The pencil pressed so hard it nearly tore the page. Somehow they know. The last few entries described the sounds of their claws scraping on the tin roof at night. He wrote that one morning, his dogs were just gone. The shed door was open, but there was no blood, no signs of a fight. They had vanished. The final entry was dated December 7th. It was just 3 lines. "No more firewood inside. Have to go to the pile. They're sitting in a perfect circle around the cabin now. We'll make the run at noon." That was it. We searched the area until dark, but found no sign of Bill. That night, we camped in his cabin. I found a crate of unsent letters he had written to his sister. In them, he talked about the isolation and the long, dark days. He admitted to seeing shadows in his peripheral vision and blamed it on a lack of sleep because the wolves' pacing kept him awake all night. The last letter, dated December 2nd, said, "Martha, if something happens to me, it wasn't the cold. This place does things to a man's mind. The wolves aren't acting like wolves anymore." Around 3 a.m., Roger woke me. He was standing by the window. I went and stood beside him. There were 6 or 7 wolves out there, sitting in the snow at the edge of the lamplight, just watching the cabin. They sat there without moving for an hour. Then, just before dawn, they all stood up in perfect unison and walked away into the trees. "We're leaving now," Roger said. We packed up Bill's journal and personal items. As our plane took off, I looked back and saw at least 20 or 30 wolves emerging from the forest, walking steadily toward the cabin as if they were reclaiming it. Our official report stated that Bill Carver had likely succumbed to the elements after wandering away, disoriented from cabin fever. But Roger and I knew that wasn't the truth. I later learned that Bill wasn't the first person to disappear from that specific area. An old Athabascan man told me his grandfather had trapped there in the 1920s, but left after one winter, saying the wolves in that valley weren't right, that they remembered things. Records showed 3 other experienced trappers had vanished from the same area between 1951 and 1969. The following summer, I went back with a small team. The cabin had completely collapsed. We found animal bones scattered around, and one set that the university lab couldn't identify. They said the remains were similar to human, but the proportions were wrong. The samples were mysteriously lost in shipping before further tests could be done. What really stayed with me was something we found carved into a tree near the cabin site. The words were old, partially covered by bark, but still legible. They learn. They wait. They remember. About 5 years after Bill disappeared, his sister received a package in the mail with no return address. Inside was Bill's wallet, perfectly preserved, with his license and a photo still inside. There was no note. I don't know what it meant, but sometimes, on sleepless nights, I wonder if the wallet was just a trapper's kindness, or if Bill is still out there, running with things that used to be wolves, but have learned to be something else entirely. The research station on San Nicolas Island had running water for only 2 hours each morning. I was 26 in the summer of 2001, fresh out of my PhD program, working my first field assignment studying sea lions off the California coast. The small facility housed 6 researchers. No one really talked about Dr. Jennifer Lawson, the biologist who had vanished from the island the year before. The official report cited rough seas and aggressive wildlife, but her untouched field notebook still sat on a shelf in the common room like a silent warning. That morning, my radio was crackling with a strange rhythmic static that sounded almost like breathing. My assigned post was the Western Rookery, a 40-minute hike along treacherous cliff paths. The dominant bull sea lion in that colony, tagged M47, and recently developed an unnerving habit of following our researchers from the water. He had a damaged left eye, clouded and white, which made his stare all the more unsettling. My task for the day was to collect tissue samples from any deceased pups I found. As I reached the observation blind, I noticed fresh boot prints in the sand leading toward the water's edge. I was scheduled to be the only one there that day. The prints were small and had a distinctive wear pattern on the heel that looked eerily familiar. I followed them to a flat section of the beach, and what I found made my blood run cold. It was Dr. Lawson's equipment bag, the one that was supposed to have been lost with her 10 months ago. Inside, her waterproof field notebook was remarkably intact. The final entry, dated the day she disappeared, was written in an increasingly erratic hand. She wrote, M47 displaying unprecedented territorial expansion, followed me 200 meters inland. Coordination with other bulls. They're moving in patterns. The entry cut off mid-sentence with a long streak of ink. As I stood there, a sudden complete silence fell over the colony of 300 sea lions. I turned and saw something that defied everything I knew about animal behavior. The bulls had formed a perfect semicircle at the water's edge, all facing me. M47 was in the center, his massive head lowered in a hunting posture. My radio was still just emitting that rhythmic static. The bulls then began a slow, deliberate advance up the beach, maintaining their formation with unnatural coordination. I fumbled for the flare gun in my backpack. I fired it into the air, but the loud noise and bright red burst only made them pause for a few seconds before they resumed their advance. M47 made a strange sound, something between a growl and a clicking noise, and the other bulls responded, adjusting their positions. I heard a splash from the ocean behind the advancing group and saw more bulls emerging from the surf, cutting off any escape along the beach. They were forming a pincer movement. That's when I heard human footsteps on the cliff path above me. It was Christine Garrett, another researcher who was supposed to have left for the mainland 2 days ago. Her clothes were filthy, and she had a completely blank expression, like she was sleepwalking. Behind her were 2 more figures, Dr. Phillips and Mark Reeves, both researchers who had been reported missing from other stations along the coast over the past 18 months. They all had the same vacant stare. Christine's mouth opened, and she made that same clicking growl as M47. The bulls below responded, creating an opening in their formation, a clear path leading directly to the water. I finally understood. Jennifer Lawson hadn't drowned. She was out there somewhere, just like these others. I scrambled up a steep section of rocks as the 3 researchers followed me with inhuman persistence. Just then, I heard a helicopter. The supply run wasn't scheduled for another week. My flare must have been seen. As the helicopter approached, the bulls below retreated to the water, their formation dissolving as if a switch had been flipped. Christine and the others stopped their pursuit, their heads tilted at identical angles, listening to the aircraft, and then they were just gone. There was no trace of them on the trail. Dr. Harrison himself was on the helicopter. "Did you get the samples?" he asked, his voice urgent. When I nodded, he took my backpack and guided me toward the helicopter. "We need to evacuate now," he said. "There's been a contamination at the mainland facility. We're shutting down all field stations." As we lifted off, I swear I saw a dozen human figures standing waist-deep in the surf, all facing our departing aircraft. The program was suspended indefinitely. The official reason was budgetary constraints. The tissue samples I collected vanished into a bureaucratic black hole. I ended up teaching high school biology in Ohio, as far from the ocean as I could get. But I kept Dr. Lawson's notebook. Every few years, I check the marine biology journals, and I see the patterns. Stations that close suddenly, researchers who transfer without notice, and always reports of unusually aggressive bull sea lions moving with an almost human intelligence. The last entry in Lawson's notebook, the one I never showed Harrison, was just 2 words, written over and over again down the entire page. They learn. I never thought that a short walk across my college campus could leave a memory so sharp it still bothers me decades later. Some fears fade with time, their edges soften by the years until they become little more than amusing anecdotes. But this one is different. This one stayed sharp, a shard of ice permanently lodged in my memory, a constant reminder that the world we think is safe is just a thin, fragile veneer over something else entirely. I was a 19-year-old student back then, a sophomore at a small state college in the Alaskan interior. My life was a simple, predictable routine of classes, late nights in the library trying to make sense of dense textbooks, and the occasional weekend party to break the monotony of the long, freezing semesters. The campus itself was a small, isolated cluster of brick buildings, like a little island of civilization in a vast, dark ocean of wilderness. It was surrounded on all sides by dense forests of dark spruce trees that crowded the walking paths, their branches heavy with snow for most of the year, seeming to lean in as if to listen to our conversations. In a place like that, you get used to the quiet and the dark. The sun would set in the mid-afternoon during the winter, and the world would be plunged into a deep, profound blackness, broken only by the yellow glow of the campus lampposts. Walking alone at night wasn't just common. It was a necessity. We never thought twice about it. The cold and the isolation created a strange sense of community, a shared understanding that the real dangers were things like frostbite or hitting a moose with your car, not the people walking beside you. The night it happened was a Saturday in late October. The first heavy snow of the season had fallen a few days prior, and the world was still dressed in white. Midterms had just ended, and a collective sigh of relief had rippled through the student body. A friend from my sociology class was having a small party at his off-campus house, a place just on the other side of the campus grounds. It was the kind of gathering that was less of a wild party and more of a quiet celebration of survival. The house was crowded and hot, the air thick with the smell of damp coats and spilled beer. The windows were completely fogged over, sealing us in a warm, loud little bubble. I remember laughing with my friend Sarah while holding a cup of warm, flat soda. We were talking about our plans for the winter break, our voices rising to be heard over the music. But as the hours passed, the warmth and noise started to feel suffocating. I glanced at my watch and saw it was almost 2 a.m. The idea of my own quiet, cold dorm room, of sinking into my own bed, suddenly sounded like the most luxurious thing in the world. "I'm heading out," I told Sarah, yelling over a particularly loud song. "You sure?" she asked. "You can just crash on the couch. It's freezing out there." I shook my head. "Nah, I need my own bed. The walk will do me good, clear my head." It was a decision I would replay in my mind 1,000 times. A simple, mundane choice that would pivot my life on its axis. I slipped my heavy winter coat on, said a quick goodbye to a few other people, and stepped out of the stuffy house and into the brittle Alaskan cold. The change was immediate and shocking. The air was so cold it felt like a physical slap to the face, burning my lungs with every breath. The streets were completely empty. the snow on the road packed down by cars into uneven, icy ridges that shone under the sparse streetlights. The only sound in the entire world was the sharp, rhythmic crunch of my boots on the packed ice. In the distance, through the skeletal outlines of the birch trees, I could see the faint, welcoming glow of my dorm lights. It was a walk I had made countless times, a simple 10-minute journey that I had always considered perfectly safe. I walked with my hands deep in my pockets, my shoulders hunched against the wind that carried the faint, clean smell of wood smoke from the chimneys of nearby houses. The profound silence of the Arctic night settled around me. It was a silence so deep, it felt like it had weight, pressing in on all sides. I was about halfway back to my dorm, on a long, straight stretch of road that ran alongside the edge of the campus woods, when I saw something strange. Lying on the edge of the road, just at the boundary where the plowed asphalt met the deep snow of the shoulder, was a pair of women's shoes. I stopped. The sight was so out of place, so jarringly wrong, that my brain couldn't immediately process it. They weren't winter boots. They weren't even practical sneakers. They were simple, black slip-on flats, the kind a person might wear to an office or a party indoors. They were sitting neatly side by side, dusted with a light layer of fresh, wind-blown snow, as if they had been sitting there for a while. But it was the direction they were pointing that made my breath catch in my throat. They weren't pointed along the path, as if someone had kicked them off while walking. They were pointed directly toward the dark, impenetrable line of spruce trees that marked the edge of the forest. I stood there staring, my own boots planted firmly on the icy road. The silence around me suddenly felt different. It was no longer peaceful. It was heavy, expectant, like the night itself was holding its breath, waiting for me to react. My mind scrambled for a logical explanation. Maybe someone had gotten too drunk at the party and, in a moment of foolishness, had kicked off their shoes and run into the woods. But that didn't feel right. The shoes were placed too neatly, and nobody, no matter how drunk, would willingly take their shoes off in this kind of cold. The ground itself was a weapon, capable of biting through skin with a cold that was almost like a fire. Driven by a curiosity that outweighed my growing fear, I took a few steps closer. The shoes were delicate, with small decorative bows on the front. I could see the faint impression of a brand name on the insole. I reached down, my gloved fingers hesitating for a moment before I touched one. It was ice cold, stiff as a board. I looked around the area, my eyes scanning the pristine snow for any other signs. There were no footprints leading to or from the shoes. The snow around them was a smooth, undisturbed blanket. It was as if they had simply materialized there. A cold dread began to seep into my bones, a feeling far deeper than the winter air. I stood up and backed away from the shoes, turning my back on them and forcing myself to start walking again. But the easy rhythm of my walk was gone. I started walking faster, my breath puffing out in short, panicked clouds that floated past my face. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. It was a primal, instinctual feeling, the kind that whispers on the back of your neck. I kept glancing over my shoulder, my head swiveling every few seconds, but the long, straight road behind me was always empty, stretching back into the darkness, untouched. Still, I was certain I could hear a second set of footsteps. It wasn't a clear sound, more of a faint, auditory illusion. It was the crunch of ice and snow, almost perfectly synchronized with my own, but delayed by just half a second, always coming from just far enough behind to stay out of sight. I started to play little games with myself, trying to prove I was just being paranoid. I coughed a loud, sharp bark into the stillness and listened to the echo. Nothing. I changed my pace, slowing down for a few steps, then speeding up again. The phantom footsteps matched me perfectly. Finally, in a moment of desperate bravery, I stopped dead in my tracks, holding my breath. My own crunching footsteps ceased. For a moment, there was absolute silence. And then, I swear I heard it. A single soft crunch from the darkness behind me, a sound of snow giving way where I hadn't moved. That was it. My casual walk turned into a power walk, my arms pumping, my legs eating up the distance as fast as they could without breaking into a full-blown run. I didn't want to run. Running felt like an admission of panic, an invitation to a chase. By the time my dorm came into full view, lit dimly by the buzzing yellow lamp above the entrance, I was fighting a desperate urge to sprint the last 100 yards. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a figure. It was at the far end of the path, standing near the turnoff that led to the main quad. It was perfectly still, partially obscured by the drooping, snow-covered branches of a large spruce tree, as if it had been waiting for me to notice. The shape was tall and thin, but it was too dark to make out any details. It didn't move. It didn't wave. It didn't step closer. It just watched. My heart felt like it was going to beat its way out of my chest. I told myself not to stop, not to look. I fixed my gaze on the heavy wooden door of my dorm, my beacon of safety, and I pushed forward. But every step felt like it was dragging through wet cement, like the ground itself wanted to keep me there. My shoulders prickled. My back felt exposed, as though I was under a spotlight, even though the path was swallowed in near darkness. I finally reached the door, my numb fingers fumbling with the cold metal handle. I pulled it open and scrambled inside, letting the heavy wood slam shut behind me with a force I hadn't intended. The sound echoed in the empty lobby. Only then did I risk one last glance through the small, reinforced glass window in the door. The figure was gone. The path was empty. The only proof that anything had been there at all was the pair of black shoes, still sitting by the road, their dark shapes a small, horrifying stain on the perfect white snow. I didn't sleep that night. I dragged my heavy wooden desk in front of my dorm room door and sat in my chair, staring out my window at the path below until the sun finally rose. The next morning, word began to spread. Campus security had found the black flats still sitting by the road and had taken them as evidence. The campus, which had felt so safe and insular just the day before, was now buzzing with a nervous energy. In the cafeteria, students whispered about it in hushed tones, speculating about who might have left them there. The rumors started to take on a life of their own. A girl from my English class swore she had seen a tall, thin man lurking in the darker corners of the library all week, always pretending to read the same newspaper, but never turning a page. Another student mentioned someone had been spotted near the women's dorms late at night, just standing motionless under the lampposts until the lights buzzed out for the night. No one could point to a name, and no one seemed brave enough to report more than these fleeting, unsubstantiated rumors. For days after my walk, I avoided going anywhere alone. Even the familiar paths of the campus in broad daylight felt different, menacing. The shadows cast by the brick buildings seemed to stretch a little too far, and every door I passed could be hiding someone waiting. The sight of any footwear left unattended, a single boot by a doorway, a sneaker in the snow, would send a jolt of ice through my veins. The smallest out-of-place details, like a car idling for too long in the parking lot, suddenly felt like a potential threat. The campus gossip only fueled my paranoia, but deep down, I knew that what I had seen wasn't just my imagination. The police became involved. Their cars occasionally seen cruising slowly through the campus loops, but they said little publicly. A campus-wide email was sent out, a generic message about being aware of your surroundings and utilizing the buddy system at night. No one was ever arrested, and no official explanation was ever given about the shoes or the woman to whom they belonged. After a week, the chatter died down, the campus moved on, and the incident was forgotten by everyone except me. Years have passed. I graduated and built a life far away from that small Alaskan college, but the fear never really left. It became a quiet, permanent part of who I am. I never told anyone the full detailed story of what I saw that night. Not the way I'm telling it now. Not about the phantom footsteps that match my own, or the absolute stillness of the figure in the trees. Maybe putting it into words, finally, is the only way to explain why I still can't walk alone at night, on any street, in any town, without feeling the distinct and heavy weight of someone's eyes watching me from the darkness, and why I always look for what's been left behind on the edge of the road.